Remember Jacob. Now, Jacob is the son of Isaac. And does anyone remember who Jacob's grandfather is, who his grandpa is? Abraham. So you have Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. Again, all a part of the family. And Jacob's 12 sons, remember Jacob had 12 sons, and they were all born to 4 different women. So if one wife wasn't enough, Jacob decided, how about I have 4? So he had 4 wives. The first 2 being Leah and Rachel. Rachel was the wife whom Jacob really loved. And then he had their respective maidservants, and their names being Zilpah and Bilhah. And he had at least one named daughter, which is Dinah. We read about her in the couple chapters earlier. And she was born to Leah, alongside other unnamed daughters. Now, we read in chapter 38 how Jacob had a special affinity, a special love for one of his sons named Joseph, little Joe, Mr. Joey. And Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other sons. Why? Well, because Joseph was born to him in his old age. And additionally, Joseph was the firstborn son of Rachel. And again, Jacob loved Rachel. He despised Leah. But he loved Rachel, and Rachel gives him a son, being Joseph. And Jacob showed and he demonstrated his love and his affection towards Joseph by giving him a coat of many colors. I made the example of, you ever go to Goodwill and I have to buy a suit, so you buy the $20 suit from Goodwill. Well, Jacob gave Joseph a well-fitted suit. Oh, let's take your measurements, and this suit is hundreds of dollars. And again, Jacob, or Joseph, I should say, wearing these garments would have been a statement. So people typically during this day would wear ordinary working garments. They were typically short and sleeveless. But here's Joseph having a long, ornate robe with long sleeves. It meant that he was there for oversight, for management. He didn't get his hands dirty by any means. And again, by dressing Joseph in this robe, Jacob, his father, is effectively promoting his second youngest son to a position of supervisor over his hardworking brothers. And Jacob's relationship with his brothers, as we read in chapter 37, seems to be a bit strained, and it really begins to sour. And again, Joseph, being the youngest at this time, seems to have been a tattletale. So we often think of Joseph as like the perfect child. Again, I think he was just being a younger brother, maybe a little bit of a brat. And so when his brothers were out in the field doing things they ought not to be doing, Joseph overheard and would run into the living room and tell, Jacob and his mom, this is what my brothers were talking about. And then the brothers would get in trouble because Joseph was the tattletale of the family. And again, Jacob's parents as well, Isaac and Rebekah, they showed favoritism towards their favorite children. And now Jacob is repeating the same sins, the parental mistake, as his parents. And as we just mentioned, he gave him a coat of many colors. And then there comes a point when Joseph begins to dream dreams. And you remember those dreams. One of the first dreams he had was that there were 11 wheat bundles. And the 11 wheat bundles bowed down to him, his wheat bundle. Which again, I wonder what those wheat bundles mean. Joseph, you think us brothers, you think your older brothers, we're going to bow down to you? And then Joseph has another dream about 11 stars and the sun and the moon representing mom and dad, all bowing down to little Joe. And again, things started to get really strained at this point. And we read about how Joseph's brothers, when Jacob sent Joseph to go check on his older brothers, they see him from afar, they come up with a plan, they strip him from his clothes, from his robe, they throw him into a pit, and then they sell him off to a couple of Ishmaelites. Jacob's brothers, they fake his death, and they tell their father Jacob about what happened to your son Joseph. We found his robe, and it's full of blood. And this sends their dad into a state of deep brokenness and mourning because over the loss of his apparent son, Joseph. Not knowing that he wasn't actually dead, but his sons faked his death. Now we come to chapter 38. So this account is about Judah and Tamar. I will spare you the details. I am not going to be reading this account, but if you want to read it, that's fine. It's the Bible. There's worse things to read, I guess. But chapter 38 does take place around the time that the accounts of Joseph are happening. So I'm just going to relay a really quick. Judah, which was one of Joseph's brothers and Jacob's sons. Met a Canaanite girl, and has 3 children with her. 2 of her sons were wicked and died. The Lord took their lives from him. And then, it's just a bunch of wickedness. Years later, Judah's wife passes away, and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, is sent away. She hears about it. Tamar takes advantage of Judah, her father-in-law. It's just a really icky story. And again, you can read it. If you have questions, ask your parents about it. But Genesis chapter 38, to boil it down, it's a whole account of betrayal, trapping, even hypocrisy. However, it eventually ends in redemption. And Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, gives birth to twins. And the first twin to be born, his name is Perez. And Perez is the ancestor of David, and David is the ancestor of Jesus. So through, again, the Lion of the tribe of Judah is where Jesus comes from. So the Lord does redeem this messy family account, but we're not going to read it today. Maybe one of these days maybe the last day I'm here, I'll teach that. We'll see. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him an overseer of his house, and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had been made overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was all on that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So again, you remember, Joseph had been sold to Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites sell him to a man named Potiphar. Let's talk about Potiphar for a little bit. His name translates to he whom Ra gave. And if you know the Egyptians at all, the Egyptians worship the sun god, the power of Ra, if you've seen the Joseph animation movie. Or his name can also be ascribed to devoted to the sun, Potiphar. That's what it means. And Ra, again, is just an Egyptian god, one of the most vital deities in Egyptian mythology. And you can see the picture I have on there, how he's represented with having a falcon head or a hawk head with a disc and a cobra wrapped around. And Potiphar was captain of the guard. What does that mean? Well, he was basically in charge of the secret service, you can say. He was the Pharaoh's main guy when it came to security. He had the authority over state prisons, was in charge of executing what Pharaoh wanted to happen. And it's possibly that he was the chief executioner. So this is the guy that Joseph is sold to. By the way, I want to mention this real quick. I don't think y'all were thinking this at all, but I found this interesting. The biblical Hebrew word for Potiphar is saris, which can shift between meaning a court official or a eunuch. In the Jewish Talmud, Potiphar apparently purchases Joseph for a little bit more nefarious doings, questionable desires, you can say. And to protect Joseph, apparently Michael, the archangel, emasculated Potiphar. So that's what the Talmud says in Jewish tradition. It couldn't, maybe, because this could paint a better picture of why Potiphar's wife was so adamant on Joseph, because he wasn't able to fulfill his husband duties. Just want to throw that out there. I don't think any of y'all were thinking that, but just maybe it was more so for me. But we read that the Lord was with Joseph and blessed him while Joseph was working for Potiphar. And after some time, as we read, Potiphar notices that almost everything that Joseph does, it turns to gold. And he's being blessed. And so it says that Joseph found favor with Potiphar. And in such a short time, Potiphar made Joseph an overseer of his entire estate. All right, Joe, there's something about you. You're in charge now. You're second in command. And the Lord blessed him blessed Potiphar and his work and Joseph's work. So Joseph was entrusted with everything under Potiphar. The only thing that Potiphar wanted is like, hey, make sure you show me the dinner menu, but everything else, I trust you. So our first points here in this message, Joseph's faithfulness wasn't conditional on his circumstance. And whether Joseph was a favored son, or whether Joseph was a slave, or as we'll read in the next chapter, a prisoner, he consistently worked with integrity and excellence. And we can see from his character, it proves that true faithfulness is anchored in who the Lord is, not in a person's immediate environment. And whether someone is wearing a coat of many colors or is in prisoner chains, Joseph's standard of work never faltered. And again, for application for us, I think it can be easy for us, for believers, to fall into the trap of pity. I pity you, or fall into the trap of laziness or being a sluggard. What is a sluggard? You ever seen a slug? Kind of does nothing. Especially when hard circumstances come into your life. And this is what the enemy wants. The enemy wants to put out your faithfulness unto the Lord. And he will often do that through putting you through hardships, or whether that's putting you through trials. But as believers, we're called to be faithful. We're called to be good stewards of the season we find ourselves in. So whether you're going through a trial, my friend, or whether you're going through a season of blessing, you are called to be faithful. Just because the sky is falling like Chicken Little, or just because there's no money in the family bank account, or just because you're having a rough time at school, or just because you may be forgotten about by your friends or your family, that does not give you a reason to be unfaithful to the Lord. My life is such a mess right now. I'm going to not be as faithful to the Lord. No, you are called to be faithful to the Lord. We read in Daniel chapter 6, and again, Daniel, the prophet. By the way, very much like Joseph, he's taken away from his homeland and brought to Babylon, a pagan nation. And yet, when he's working for a pagan king, does Daniel become unfaithful? No, it says in Daniel chapter 6, verse 4, faithful and no error or fault was found in him. I think of the Apostle Paul. Paul went through a lot of hardships and trials. And yet, he says, I've learned how to be content in all things in Philippians chapter 4. His ministry output was never based upon his physical chains. Or think of Ruth. We discussed Ruth a couple weeks ago, or I guess during camp. And Ruth, she loses her husband, her sister is off who knows where, and she's a widow. And she's poor. And what does she do? Does she sulk in the living room like, I demand this, I demand that? No, she's like, I'm going to go work hard. And I'm going to say a word here that maybe will stir some people, but believers need to be warned about having a victim mentality. And having that be the excuse of being unfaithful. And having that, I'm not going to give the Lord my all because of life circumstances. Again, the enemy will often use another dicey word. The enemy will often use trauma to convince believers that God has abandoned them, making active obedience seem pointless. Why would you obey the Lord? You've gone through a lot of hardships in your life, Joseph. By the way, if anyone has the excuse of trauma, it's little Joe here. I highly doubt any of y'all, correct me if I'm wrong, have any of y'all been stripped naked and thrown into a pit, and then your sibling sells you off to be a slave in Africa? If that's the case, then I'm super sorry for that. But here's Job, and that's what's happened to him. But does he waver in his faith to the Lord? No. He works hard, and he's faithful. And so, guys, in times of hardships and trials, laziness acts, I think, like kind of an emotional narcotic. I'm just going through a hard time. I'm just going to pity myself. Through passivity or doomsday scrolling. And this is how the enemy gets your mind off of the Lord. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we read about Elijah. You remember, Elijah the prophet? And he has this amazing spiritual victory. He slaughters the prophets of Baal. The Lord consumes a fire with an altar, or consumes an altar with fire. And then, again, he has this massive spiritual victory. And then what happens? Queen Jezebel says, all right, whoever gives me Elijah's head on a platter, I will give him $1 million. And so what happens to Elijah? He goes off into the wilderness. Why? Because he's afraid. And then he begins to pity himself. Lord, I'm the only prophet here. My life is so hard. I'm doing all these things for you, and my life is, I have a bounty upon my head. People want to kill me. And what does the Lord do? The Lord says, take a nap, have some food, and get up. But I want to die. Get up and continue to be faithful, Elijah, and do what I've called you to do. The Lord has to confront his paralysis, his victim mentality. I'm the only one, Lord. I'm the one being faithful, and all these things are happening against me, and is it even worth it? Get up, Elijah, is what the Lord says. And so my exhortation to y'all is to be faithful. And I don't know all of your circumstances, but even when your life circumstance is tough, whether that's at school, maybe your family and home life is dynamic is a little rough, it's a mess, maybe your health is wallowing, be faithful to the Lord. And then we read in verse 6. So again, talking about faithfulness, now let's talk about opposition. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. By the way, that Hebrew word Joseph can be translated to Joshua Maweu. Just kidding. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in the house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you. Because you are his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, to lie with her, or to be with her. So, as it says, Joseph was a stellar young man. And again, he was probably around, he was 17 when his brothers sold him into slavery. So, he's a young man. He's stellar. He's handsome. He has a nice jawline. Maybe he has some abs. He's really looking. By the way, his grandma, Rebecca, was known as being very attractive. And also his mom, Rachel, was known to be very attractive. So, he gets the good genes in the family. And Potiphar's wife, Mrs. P, I'll call her, has the hots for Joseph. What does it say in verse 7? Casting longing eyes on Joseph. You ever do that? You have a crush at school or during summer camp, and you're just like, this is what Mrs. P is doing. But again, she's married. And Mrs. Potiphar, tries to tempt Joseph into having relations with her and to sleep with her. I think they wanted to do a little bit more than just sleeping, I think. But to my second point, there's often after high and mountaintop experiences or moments with the Lord, and I think Joseph was feeling this way, that's when the enemy will attack. That is when the enemy will tempt, and that's when opposition will come into your life. And again, context, by the way, Joseph, many speculate that Joseph lived in Potiphar's house for about 11 years, so over a decade, and he was in prison for at least 2 years. But again, Joseph has gone through a lot. And maybe, after the years have passed and being in Potiphar's home, maybe he started making peace over the situation he was in. The Lord's blessing me. I'm in Egypt. I know what happened to me in the past hurt a lot. But life is doing pretty good. I'm second in command in Potiphar's home, and I'm being in charge of his management. Things are starting to level out for Joseph in his life. And then the enemy, El Diablo, the devil, uses Mrs. Potiphar to try and get Joseph to become unfaithful to the Lord. Again, it's after mountaintop experience that when we often experience opposition. Now think of Jesus. This happened to Jesus. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River by his cousin John the Dunker, right? John the Baptist. And he's filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. And then what do we read next? And then he's sent into the wilderness to be tempted 40 days and 40 nights. We often think that the enemy tempted Jesus once throughout that time. 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus was tempted by the devil. Or think about this, guys, and this applies to a lot of y'all. Coming back from camp, it is often before camp and after camp, you will experience opposition because you come back like, man, I'm so encouraged. The Lord really spoke to me. about what it means to be a godly man, what it means to be a godly woman, and you tell your parents, hey, I want to start doing this in my life. I want to start conducting myself in to be masculine or to be feminine, and your parents, okay, we'll see how long that lasts. It's like, what was that? The enemy, jabbing you a little bit, bringing opposition. Or then you get that notification on your phone and you've been back into town for less than 5 minutes. It's like, do I go back to that? It's the enemy tempting you. And when the rubber meets the road, guys, Joseph, even though he had a rough season, he did not neglect purity and he did not neglect integrity, which I think is an example to all of us to not justify sin because of life circumstances. Joseph could have made the sinful retaliation and that, I deserve this. I deserve to be with Mrs. Potiphar. I've gone through a lot in my life, and I've been faithful for over a decade, and, let me just sin a little bit. But you are not called to rationalize your sin, to make excuses for your sin. Because here's the thing, the closer you get to the mousetrap, the closer you are for your neck to be snapped in half. And Joseph refuses to compromise with his master's wife. And again, he says, I've been entrusted with so much. Potiphar's given me everything, and I'm a slave. So why would I throw that away for a quick second, couple of seconds of pleasure? But read, when tempted, Joseph doesn't say, come be with me, Joseph. What if Potiphar finds out? He doesn't say that. He says in verse 9, how then can I do this great wickedness against Potiphar? No, against God. He knew I am accountable to the Lord first and foremost. However, Mrs. P could not take no for an answer. And so here she is, day in and day out, tempting Joseph. But it says Joe did not heed her, which literally means he didn't give any attention to her. I maybe this had been kind of building. Maybe Mrs. Potiphar is trying to be like super obvious, and Joseph is not getting the hint. And Mrs. P says, Joseph, come be with me. It's like, oh, no. And again, he doesn't give any attention to her. Mrs. Potiphar comes in for a hug. Joseph, hey! And he's like, nice to meet you, ma'am. With the handshake. I'm not even going to. It's like, hey, Joseph, can you teach me how to play billiards? Can you teach me how to play pool? I know that cliche. I'm not going to do that, Mrs. Potiphar. I'm sorry. Joseph, you look striking in your uniform today. Oh, thank you. I'll tell HR. These uniforms are really nice. No, Joseph, you're not getting the hint. Or Joseph, my phone doesn't work. Can you come into my room and fix it? Turn it off and turn it back on again, and let me know how it goes. He's not giving her any ounce, and he's trying to avoid her. Every guys, you're at Sam's Club. It's always at Sam's Club, and you see someone and you really don't want to interact with them. So you're like, okay. That's what Joseph is doing here. But then things take a turn for the worse. In verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought in to us a Hebrew. By the way, that word Hebrew, the Jews weren't really called Hebrews, and they weren't called Jews during this time. Hebrew was kind of a slang term for those, like a hippie, that sojourner, that foreigner. So it's a racial slur she's using there. This Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice, and it happened. When I heard that, I lifted my voice and cried out. Then he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So one day, as little Joe is vacuuming, maybe he's dusting the fan, he's doing his management. Maybe he's walking around the hallway and he takes the turn, and then Mrs. Potiphar is there. It's like, oh! And she grabs him and says, come lie with me. Trying to get him to commit infidelity, sexual immorality. You don't get the hint. And anyways, it's a shift from seduction to force. Come with me. And Joseph, as we read, not thinking twice, bolts out of the room. No, thank you. Joseph is a great example of what to do when temptation comes. Well, what is that? Run. Do not look back. Do not dabble, close to the line of sin. And by physically trapping him in an empty house, the enemy tried to make Joseph feel like sin is inevitable. There's no way out of this one. All you can do is sin, But there's always a choice. Joseph was not forced to sin with his master's wife. And by the way, you are not forced to think those thoughts. You are not forced to speak like that. You are not forced to dress like that. You are not forced to act like that. You have the choice. And a believer in the Lord will always find a way out of temptation. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. The Lord did. Again, there's no men at the house during this time, which I don't think is a coincidence. And where are all the men? Well, I don't know. Where'd they go? Mrs. P with their deceptive nature. But I want to expound upon this point a little bit. How do you deal with temptation? I have 3 points. I like my points. Number 1, how to deal with temptation? Flee. By the way, fleeing is not cowardice. No, you got to stand up and fight for yourself. No, fleeing is strategy. And I think the word, it gives a explicit military-style command when it comes to facing sexual temptation. It's not that you stand and you begin to talk and negotiate over the temptation. Well, what if I do this? Well, then I would do this. I don't know about that. No, what's your assignment? Cadet, you are to run away when you see that. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18 says, flee sexual immorality. And Joseph understood that. Again, Paul encourages Timothy, gives Timothy that same advice in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. Flee the desires of your youth. Run away. Don't walk. Don't kind of, just take my time. Run. Sprint. Get out of there. And number 2, don't dabble. Don't dabble. Don't get close to the line. And again, this is where negotiating with the temptation, with the sin, starts to come into play. You're negotiating, you're staying near the temptation. I'm just going to go to the bar. I'm not going to drink. I'm just going to go to the bar. Okay. I'm just going to go over to her house. She's really lonely and she needs a friend. Right. Yeah. We know where that's leading. I'm not going to do anything. Yeah, but you're dabbling with it. You're getting really close to the edge of the cliff. You're getting really close to take that example, the mouse trap. I'm just going to reorient the cheese. Yeah, but your finger's about to get caught. And the Bible warns even approaching the physical boundary of seduction. Again, specifically sexual immorality. Solomon warns regarding the adulterous woman in Proverbs 5, verse 8. Stay away from her. Don't go near the door of her house. Don't sit next to her in class. If you have an assignment with her as a teacher, can I get someone else? I think a perfect example of this is Samson and Delilah. Samson repeatedly toyed with the boundary, treating Delilah's trap as a game. Oh, it's this, it's that, it's this. And he tarried. And he allowed her to press him day in and day out. And eventually, Samson gave in. And what happened? He lost his strength and he lost his eyes. By the way, what does it say in 1 Kings chapter 2? We taught this on Father's Day. 1 Kings chapter 2 says, Solomon, show yourself strong and be a man. Also says, I think it's in Proverbs 28, 29, somewhere around there. Don't give your strength to a woman. But here Samson does. Because he's dabbling near Delilah's house. So don't dabble near the line or your neck is going to get caught in the mousetrap. And lastly, number 3, pay the cost. True holiness prioritizes spiritual integrity over physical comfort or reputation or material loss or pleasure. Joseph was willing to look ridiculous to stay righteous. And Jesus heavily emphasizes this radical principle. He commands that if there's any part of your life which is causing you uh, to sin, to fall, to be tempted over and over again, this is what you do. You take the kitchen butcher knife and you chop it off. And if your eye is causing you to sin, get a fish hook. You like fishing, and gouge out your eye. Being pure, guys, if remaining holy, again, holy means to be set apart. To be holy for the Lord means you got to get rid of your iPhone and to get a flip phone, or maybe you need to cut ties with friends. Every time I'm around these friends, we're always talking about things negative. We're always venting about this situation, this circumstance, and talking bad about others. Maybe you need to cut ties with those friends. I've been friends with them forever. Yeah, but you're not being holy unto the Lord, are you? Or maybe you need to change your gym schedule. I'm going to go at 5:30 when everyone is there and all the women get out of. Maybe you need to go early in the morning when no one's there, huh? Or maybe you need to leave an awkward conversation in the middle of it. Where are you going? I can't be a part of this talk. Why? We're just bantering. We're just joking. Yeah, but it's really starting to get crass. Or maybe you need to walk out of a movie theater. But I paid, how much is a ticket these days? Like $300? I paid $300 for this movie ticket. Well, if $300 means you're going to be holy, then so be it. We do it without hesitation. So accept the temporary awkwardness. Purity, guys, requires radical, real-world boundaries. So protect your heart. Well, what if I lose my garment? Then so be it. And when he left, as I just mentioned, Mrs. Potiphar grabs hold of Joseph in his robe. Maybe it comes off him or tears, whatever happens. She begins to yell, "Men, guards, come help!" And the guard's like, "What's going on, Mrs. Potiphar? That Hebrew, they tried to mock me." By the way, mock is a euphemism for, again, this is being recorded for YouTube, so attempted assault. You probably know what that means. And again, she's completely reversing the reality of what actually happened. So what happens? Mr. Potiphar gets a phone call. He comes home. Mrs. Potiphar explains her version of the events as we read verse 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, "Your servant did to me after this manner," that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So when Potiphar heard his wife, he became angry. Specifically, the words, "Your servant did to me after this manner." So what happens? Potiphar puts little Joe into prison, where the king's prisoners were kept. Now, here's the thing. Did Potiphar believe in his wife? I'm of the opinion that I don't think so. Again, I can't be for sure. I think he's just caught in the middle of a political dilemma. Here's my wife, and here's this Hebrew. Well, I can't go along with the Hebrew here. It's my wife. And so there's 2 points I want to point out. Number one, why do I not think Potiphar believed in his wife? Well, number one, little Joe, avoided execution. Again, Potiphar is the captain of the guard. He can command, "All right, Joseph, you're dead." But he doesn't do that. And I think it shows Joseph's character. By the way, this would be another perfect sermon for when people begin to slander you. Maybe I'll teach that next time I teach through Genesis chapter 39. I don't think he believed that Joseph would violate his wife. And so instead of executing him on the spot, he sends him to prison. And then also in verse 19, I think there's a little ambiguity of Potiphar's anger. It's like, who is it being directed towards? I think it's kind of being directed towards the situation. Like, goodness me, what am I going to do? I love Joseph. I trust Joseph. But my wife is, this is not going to be good for my political career. All right, Joe, I'm not going to kill you, but I'm going to throw you into prison. Again, I'm speculating. Again, many commentators think so. I just want to throw that out to you. However, as we read towards the end, in the midst of Joe's life being upheaved once more, it says the Lord was still with him. And he found favor in the prison. Joseph was given the duty of taking charge of the prisoners, so he's the one writing everything down. He's the one taking note of the ins and outs of the prison. And the warden, it reads, says, the warden doesn't even need to worry about Joseph. Yeah, the warden says, I trust Joe. He's got everything under control. The Lord was with him. So in conclusion, there are three main points we hit in this message. And the first one was that Joseph's faithfulness wasn't conditional. It wasn't conditional on the things that were happening around him. And that should be the case for believers. Your faith should not have conditions. If the Lord, if this happens and this happens in my life, then I'm going to be faithful. Well, what if it doesn't happen? What if those conditions aren't met? Just like Joseph, even if your brothers fake your own death and sell you into slavery, you are called to be faithful. You're called to work hard. Number two, as discussed, it's often after high and mountaintop moments with the Lord, that's when the enemy will attack. How will he attack? Well, maybe he'll make sure your water heater is busted and there's bats in your house and your AC doesn't work. Maybe he'll do that. That's when the Lord will bring opposition into your life. But what are we called to do? We're called to hold on to the Lord. Lord, I know I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death after just coming down from the mountain, but I'm going to hold on to you when I'm in the valley. So recognize that after those camp times, after those conferences, after those Sunday mornings, it's always like after the men's conference, honey, I'm sorry for the way I've been treating you. I'm going to be a godly man. Yeah, okay. That's the enemy bringing opposition to you. It's like, you know what? This is why I'm not. And that's how it goes. So recognize that after those mountaintop experiences, the enemy is not far behind. And lastly, flee the mousetrap. Flee temptation. Don't get so close to the mouth. I just want a little bite. And then your neck is snapped in half. And again, the more you're faithful, the longer the duration of your faithfulness to the Lord. Just know the enemy is headed your way, ready to bring you candy, ready to show you, hey, look at this tree. Why don't you take a bite from that tree? But we're called not to talk with the serpent. We're not called to talk with Mrs. P. Well, what do you have to offer me? No, you're called to run. Is running cowardice? No, as I mentioned before, it's strategy. So again, be faithful. But know this, that faithfulness in the Lord will attract opposition.